I'm back. Okay, I'm going to be trying to explain Thomas Piketty's R over G principle here again, but I have it a bit more prepared this time, so hopefully I'm going to sound a little more sane. This isn't going to be the video that I have for this forever, but I would like to do this as an exercise to sort of get my own thoughts together and put something else on YouTube, because why not? I don't care. So, Thomas Piketty releases this book. It's great for me. I'm a little economic progressive, and this book helps me to identify some trends that I think are really important. These have been disputed because fucking everything in academia has been disputed, but I think overall this has some great trends, and I'd like to use it eventually in terms of thinking about rhetoric and how to implement this into a campaign message, since I think you can back up a campaign with numbers from all of this. So, to start off, let's look at some of these, what's the word that I'm looking for? Not intervals, not integers, I don't know, variables. Sorry, I'm not a math person anymore. So let's look at some of these variables real quick and get an idea for what's actually going on. So first, we have I, or income, which is just, this is all for, each of these is kind of describing an economy as a whole, a totality of an economy, right? So first we have the income, I for income, which is GDP. Technically it's not GDP, but it works for the numbers, which is the total income in an economy for a given year, right? And then we've got the growth rate for a given year. This is how much your GDP increases year over year. Next is the total capital stock. And this one is a little hard to get your head around because I don't think we usually talk about this very much. But total capital stock is just everything that there is in the economy. So you've got like stocks, and you've got homes, and you've got fucking factories, and you've got Taco Bells, and you've got everything. Everything that is an asset that somebody owns is part of this total capital stock. And how this is defined in Piketty's book, and the number that I'm using for this is total household wealth. Once I actually make this into like a fully fleshed out video, I'll get all of the statistics. There's one place that I found that had most of these that I used. I'll probably link that in the description and give quick links to all of those things, so you can go and check them out yourself. But total capital stock, the total value of everything that is owned in the economy. Bam. R is the rate of return on capital. Now, like I said, going back to all of this, total capital stock, average rate of return on that capital, right? Granted, some things will be more productive than others. Factory is going to be more productive than, say, a house, right? Probably going to be greater return if you're pumping things out and then trying to sell it, versus a house, not a whole lot of financial gains that you're getting there, right? Although there is, property values go up, but that's besides the point. Then there's this. This is one of the key things that Piketty, also I think I'm saying his name wrong, but I don't give a rip, he's French. So this is the capital to income ratio. How much of the total capital stock is there relative to a year's income, right? Now in traditional economies, this hovered typically between 5 and 6. In the United States, for the longest time, it was actually around 3 or 4, which we'll get into the reasons why in a second. But just know that the total amount of stuff relative to GDP is usually around 6. As a brief example for the United States, let me see if I have the numbers here. There are some estimates, or some of these numbers are going to be a little bit off, based off of, because I pulled some different ones. But the vibe, the gist is, oh, here it is. That's not what it is. Sorry, I'm a liar. The one that I got is $161.8 trillion for total household wealth in 2024. I should write this down. 161.8 dollars with a T. All the shit in the US economy. Yes? Gotcha? Following? Capiche? Divided by that year's GDP, which was, this is different, but the number that I got, like I said, I pulled some different statistics from different places. So in the updated video, it'll be correct, but this should be a close estimate. 28.5 trillion Again, trillion with a T, we're talking big numbers here. And this ratio brings us to about 5.92. So 2024, the year that we have our most accurate data for, is sticking us at a total capital to income ratio of about 5.92. Got it? Great. Now, the next thing that we're going to want to talk about is the savings rate. So the savings rate is just like, you got all this income. Great. Everyone got some income. But, well, some people are going to spend it. Great. But some people are going to save it. And then they're going to reinvest it. This is why everyone tells you don't just sit on your savings. Savings, in how both Piketty uses it and how rich people use it, keep that in mind, is more reinvesting into capital, right? Your savings add to the total capital stock. If you're just holding on to like $100,000 and not investing them, you're either a bank or you're stupid. You should go invest. Say you want to keep $10,000 for emergency savings, right? You go and you invest the other $90,000 so your money starts growing and doesn't get eaten away by inflation, right? Wonderful. So savings increases the total capital stock. Now, we're getting somewhere interesting, and this is where I start to get socialist. Not really. I still like capitalism, but let's write it in. Okay. So the issue here is the amount of total income in the economy that is getting split between labor and capital. Now, typically this ratio is somewhere in the range of people like to say 30-70. So 30% of the income is going back to capital, back to assets and the people who own those assets. Primarily, assets don't own other assets, you know what I mean? If it's going back to assets, it's going back to rich people. Now, labor, on the other hand, is people working for their jobs, right? I worked at T-Bell before, I worked at Starbucks. That was me. I was part of this chunk over here where I was getting money from my labor. Beautiful. But then, guess what happens? Now we get to start moving some numbers around, right? So, this is the total income. And the key thing that Piketty wants to point out is that, first of all, very frequently are the rate of return on capital, how much your capital is giving back to you, right? If that is bigger than G, the growth rate of the economy, we got a fucking problem. And this makes sense kind of intuitively. If there is an asset that's growing faster than the rest of the economy, well, clearly it's sucking up some of the other value from the economy into it, because it's not just, money's not coming out of nowhere, right? Does that make sense? I hope I'm making sense. So that makes sense on an intuitive level, but it's a self-reinforcing process, which is the thing that Piketty and I have an issue with. Because once that happens, shit gets ugly, right? So R is greater than G. Why is this a problem? Well, when you have this whole capital stock, right? And again, this is where I'm going to start to use 2024 numbers. So we can get a picture of where we're sort of at right now, and then I'll give some historical context for where we've been previously. So, I should have left the numbers up there, shouldn't I? Well, oopsies. The point is, we've got a lot of shit in our economy. If you recall, the ratio that I mentioned is 5.92, right? That's this number over here. That's the beta, is the total amount of capital over income. Now, the US has a relatively high rate of that right now, but why is that bad? Well, because mathematically, remember, these are all definitions. So it's interesting because then we can definitionally define some of these with equations relative to each other, and we're going to do math. And this is where I need to fully understand it, so I, as someone who wants to do politics eventually, can turn it into a campaign message. And hopefully this will help you if you're also a progressive person and want to do that. So, total stock of capital. right, times the rate of return on capital. Based off the numbers that I did, that I crunched, which again, in the more fleshed out video, I'll go through how I solved for R, even though it's not out there that I could find. First of all, if you look up what the average rate of return on capital is, most places say between 6 and 7% once you adjust for inflation, which is actually in the ballpark of what I got, right? Which, putting that up here, that would be what's my exact number that I got? 0.074 is bigger than the US's typical growth rate, which in 2024 was, I believe, 2.5 in that ballpark. So 0.025. This is a lot bigger. This is a lot bigger. This is almost 3 times bigger than this one. This shit is a problem. Icky. Got it? Because with this whole capital stock, if the growth rate, if the rate of return on all of this capital isn't an average, remember, this is averaging everything across the whole county, 0.74. Well then, remember, this is relative to the total income of the economy. This 5.92 number is relative to, is the amount of stuff we have relative to how much we make in a year. So if this is the rate of return that it gives, and that comes out to 0.405, if I did my math correctly. That comes up to 0.405. That means 40% of all income in the economy is going to capital, to people who own shit. That's not great. And it's even worse because we'll get into it in a second. The issue is that this will self-perpetuate. Because when there's, say, 40% of it owned by capital, well, or income going to capital, okay, great. We come back and this total capital stock, right, is now being increased because there's savings. Especially because, people who own a lot of shit, they don't need to spend most of their money. They're not consuming nearly as much as they're raking in. Otherwise, they wouldn't become billionaires. They would just consume it instead. But they sit and they grow their wealth, right? And that's why, capital gains exists. That's what capital gains are. It's people sitting on their wealth on productive assets and letting it skyrocket. So we've got this. Give me 2 seconds to garner my thoughts. Okay, so if the rate of return on capital does not decrease, then this over here, this 5.92 number, will go up, right? This number goes up, the total amount of capital stock. Say, let's increase it from 5.92. We're gonna go fast. It's speedy. Say it goes up to 7.5. Pretty substantial increase, right? So now there's way more shit in the economy. And again, that's not what it would actually be. You're not getting that crazy amount of savings. But you're getting a lot of stuff in the economy. You got a lot of stuff that's making a lot of shit relative to the amount of income that exists, right? Relative to the actual growth of the economy. Well, say it stays at this 0.74. What's gonna happen then? If it's I can't do math in my head. Is that gonna be 100%? Is that gonna be real bad? Probably. Well, 0.75 times, this is math that I should be able to do, right? Is this gonna turn out to be 1? I'm gonna be embarrassed. Pause. Well, I'm glad that I looked it up because it's not 1, and I was right to think it wasn't 1. So what this will actually do is if you keep that same amount of return on capital, you're following? The capital is still being equally productive, but now there's more of it. Necessarily, that will create, again, definitionally, according to the amount of income that's in the economy, that will, if the growth rate stays the same, that's critical. If the growth rate stays the same, if the growth rate increases, then this won't be as much of an issue, right? Because then there will be room for some of the income for labor to grow as well, which is what we hope for. But assuming that the growth rate stays relatively stable at this 0.25 number, What will happen instead is a larger share, and again, that's because this too, like if the growth rate increases, then this would not increase. This would not increase as much if the growth rate increases simultaneously, because coming back to this, John, it's the total capital, this C here, over the income in the economy. So if the total income in the economy grows, if that's growing faster and it's growing at an equivalent rate to R, it's not an issue, right? This is why it's an issue. Because you come over here, and then all of a sudden, oh shit, same productivity for this, but more of it. Wealth gets sucked up into those assets, and all of a sudden, now 55%. 55% of the whole economy is going to capital. Which would be fine if we all owned capital, and if we all owned it in relatively equivalent amounts. But we don't. Capital is very concentrated. It's owned by a lot of it's owned by like a little tippy top of people. And simultaneously, a lot of us don't have fucking capital. I'm in debt. Other people I owe people money. I have negative capital. Negative. So it becomes a problem because most of us work for our income. So if there's less of the pie, I got less, which is why a lot of people have been feeling the squeeze recently. And this is a fundamental issue, but it's exacerbated. Why do you think? Because of capitalism. Boom. Now why is that? So again, we understand why this is an issue, because it will always increase this relative ratio of capital to labor in the equation where the amount of capital, or the amount of income going to labor and the amount of income going to capital is all equal to 1. This is a different C than the one over there. Got it? In that world, 0.55 is here. 0.45 is here. And that all equals 1. And notice how this is less. This is not good. Traditionally, like I said, it's 70-30, where 70% of income goes to labor. Now, I don't think we're approaching 7.5 anytime soon. Maybe we are. We might be, actually, and I'll get to that. But it will continue to go up so long as savings increase. And the fascinating thing about this is the reason why, and Piketty talks about this, we had periods of relative, what's the word I'm looking for? When everything's fair, when you work harder, and meritocracy. We had a meritocracy relative to today. It was more so a meritocracy when boomers were around. Why is that? Well, because there was this big old destruction of capital. We were out here, it's World War II. Oh, I'ma get you. Oh, I'ma get you. You feel me? So there's this huge destruction of assets, not only because physical shit is getting destroyed in the war, but people need to liquidate things so we can turn those liquid assets into missiles to send over to fucking Europe while all this shit's going down, right? So big destruction of capital, guess what that does? All of a sudden, this ratio is way smaller. It's not 7.5 anymore. And it wasn't even 4. It goes down to like 3. It goes down to like 3. And then all of a sudden, bing, bang, boom. Bing, bang, boom. This is like, I don't know, round up, 0.22. 0.22% of the economy. Like 80% of income is going to labor. So if you work and you work hard, you get more shit. No way. And that's exactly what for our grandparents, that's exactly what it was like. For me, nah. I should have bought a house in 2008 when I was 5. That's what I should have done. But, I didn't have any fucking assets. Couldn't buy them. So, what does this all mean? Basically, it means we're fucked. As long as this persists, as long as the rate of return on capital is greater than the growth of the economy, we're boned. At least unless you own a bunch of money or a bunch of stocks, you know what I mean, productive assets. Now here's the reason this is even more exacerbated. Because right now, like I said, we're at roughly 60-40. We're at like 60-40, where 60% of income is still going to labor and 40% is still going to capital, which is, hell of a lot worse than the 30-70 that it used to be. Actually, I think it was closer to like 65-35 in like the 70s. That's when it was at its best for the United States. But it's worse because, that's just income going to labor or capital. But first of all, capital is very, very skewed in terms of ownership. The one percenties are like over here. That's a percent sign. The one percenties are over here. They own so many fucking stocks. They own so many homes. They got everything under the sun. They own the sun. If you're a billionaire, buy whatever the hell you want, right? But then other people, they don't own that much shit. Like I told you, I'm negative. I'm fucking down here because I got student loans. I owe the government money. I just wanted a degree. So, not only is this wealth distribution skewed by a lot, the income distribution is also skewed, right? So, some people are in these big ass fancy wancy positions where I'm a CEO and I basically fucking smoke crack in my office all day and get to do whatever I want. Wolf of Wall Street, that's like the American dream, right? Is you just trade stocks, you don't actually do any hard work, and then it's hedonism, right? And that is the epitome of American life, is to be hedonistic and a CEO of some company. That's the image we paint in our heads, right? But these CEOs, they make so much money, and then they're able to save most of that money, so they just shove it right into stocks, and then they're growing that wealth exponentially for fucking 40 years, and then they become a billionaire. And then simultaneously, next great point, some capital is more productive than others. A significant amount of wealth for the middle class, and the bottom 50% of people own like nothing. Like 1 to 2% of total national wealth for the bottom 50% of people, right? So they're not even part of the question. They've always been down there. But the middle class, the middle 40%, is where we got really innovative in the 20th century after World War II. That's where there was actually like a historically significant shift, where now if you're middle class, hey, I can own a house. I have a retirement fund. And the majority of the wealth for the middle class is tied up in homes, which are not very economically productive relative to a factory, like I said, or in pension funds, which are mostly through the stock market, so it's fine, right? That's going to be growing relatively significantly. But the thing is, think about billionaires. What do billionaires do? Venture capitalists. Well, I got time. I'm going to sit here. I'm going to Rudy toot my way over here. I'm going to invest in some startup. We're going to start a business. And now I'm raking in big bucks because I did fucking DoorDash. And I literally, murdered all the competition by just funding for like 6 years at a loss until there's no more competition. Same thing with Uber, right? And that's where we start to get into like, okay, now billionaires are just straight up like actively destroying parts of the economy to bring in more of their wealth. Because we have the legal system, which allows them to get very high returns on their capital and decrease the growth rate of the economy while they're fucking everyone else over, right? It's a beautiful thing if you're a billionaire or a very wealthy individual. Now, granted, regular people can also invest in those things, right? If you're a regular person, I can invest in venture capital funds. Sure you can. But like, most people aren't sitting there. And frankly, you're usually an asshole if you're sitting there looking at stocks all day. That's just the truth. I'm sorry. So, the goal is that we should bring this down. And this is what it was for 2024, by the way. $17.7 trillion went to labor, and around $12 trillion went to capital, and that gives us a GDP of like 29.7 million, right? Beautimous. So, that's the issue. These are the problems. Not only will the amount of money that goes to capital continue increasing if we don't solve this, but also the distribution of income that's going to labor anyways is also incredibly skewed, also going towards people who are already mostly wealthy. And on top of that, capital is also very disproportionately skewed. Most of it is owned by the top 10% of people, and they have access to much more productive assets. Remember, go back to this 7.074 number, right? Some stocks are more valuable, some are less. And on average, if you're rich, you're gonna have access to capital that's way more productive than that. In fact, if you're owning like a factory and it's not incorporated, you're probably making, if you're making over 8% profit margins, you're good, right? I guess not profit margins, but do the math. I'm not a fucking genius. You get my point though. If you can get good profit margins on a business, then you can probably get it above this number, right? Depending on what it is. And that type of capital is usually only owned by very, very, very wealthy people.
So, what do we do about it? Tune in next episode, where I talk about rhetoric
And how the hell we turn this into campaigns, which I think is basically what the hell I talked about in my last 42-minute video. But this one's shorter, you're welcome. Maybe I'll upload it in 2 parts. Okay. This was so fun. Bye. Oh, be mindful and be kind. And ignore my breakout.